I want to welcome everyone, and as is our habit now, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. The Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today. We have guests, we're very excited. We have guests joining us from all over the US and abroad. This has certainly been one of the silver linings of being apart from you physically, but to be able to include so many more people who used to find it difficult to come for our live events at the museum. So thank you for being here. We are really striving hard to create a hopeful community online, and you, our fellows, are really the heart of that community. So thank you for your continued support, for staying connected, for participating in our online events. I can't tell you how much that means to us. Also including internally for staff morale. You can imagine for members of our staff who are, we are all museum professionals. We signed on to work in a beautiful building with beautiful objects. We have neither right now, nor do we have access in person to each other. So, as one of our staff said recently, the best part of working for a museum is working in a museum. Since we can't do that, we are doing our very darndest to create the spirit of the museum, and your connectivity with us, your participation is a huge part of keeping that enterprise going. I did want to remind you that next week we have Art and Ideas, which was our annual in-person gathering for supporters and donors, and always something we looked forward to so much, to be able to welcome you in person and share what we're doing. But we're going virtual this year for everyone's protection, and I think you'll find that there are some benefits to that. You may be able to participate in more sessions, for example. You can participate from home. If something starts on the early side, you can still be in your pajamas if you need to be, or bring your coffee and your breakfast with you. So we do hope that if you haven't registered, you will. Registration is still open. And we really, really do look forward to connecting with you, where you will get a big sense of all that's going on right now. Many of you know what kinds of programs we've been offering, but you may not know what kinds of research projects are going on behind the scenes, what exhibitions we're working on, what we're doing with students, and this is our chance to share all of that with you, and you, of course, always are part of inspiring us as well at this event. So please do register. You can register only for the events that suit your calendar. So now for today's events, just a few logistics. I would ask everyone to mute their microphones for now. We will have a Q&A at the end. And then also we've tried something different, which is after the Q&A, we will keep the Zoom link open for those who just want to socialize and have a chance to chat and talk to the curators and each other. We're trying to figure out how to use Zoom for more social experiences for our museum family. So do stay on after the Q&A if you can, and be part of that. One last logistical issue, if you have questions as we go, please type them into the chat feature. And at the end, during the Q&A, I will read out those questions to our speakers so they can address them. But instead of dealing with them in the middle of their presentation, which could slow us down and be a bit disruptive, we're going to take those questions at the end. But please log them in whenever they occur to you in the chat, and we'll come to them after the spoken presentation. So now I'd like to introduce today's program and speakers. As you know, I am a former curator of prints and drawings, many years logged in at the Art Institute of Chicago in this role, along with my colleague Suzanne McCullough, who's on this call today. So hello, Suzanne. Lovely to have you with us. That, makes me very happy to be at an institution where works on paper are so central. Prints and drawings constitute numerically a huge part of the collection and qualitatively an even bigger part of the collection. And they have remained central to pedagogy at Harvard, particularly through the good works of two consecutive curators, Jerry Cohn and now Elizabeth Rudy, who have devoted themselves to connecting students to the print collection. And today you'll get a sense of how their print charisma is enticing generations of print students to get involved with these wonderful collections. This collection really does now attract interdisciplinary work and interest, and this is something that's being actively fed by the museum. We also have a number of print exhibitions that are in the works, on the calendar, despite the fact that the calendar has shifted quite a bit thanks to our COVID situation. But we now have three really substantial print projects on the exhibition calendar with set dates. One is States of Play, Prints from Rembrandt to Picasso, which is opening in the fall of 2021. So that's next fall. And that is the focus of today's program. I also want you to know that we have Dare to Know, Prints and Drawings in the Age of Enlightenment, opening in the fall of 2022, so 1 year later. And then prints, major acquisition of 80 prints that we made from the Brandywine Press in Philadelphia. These are prints by artists of color who worked over the last 50 years with Brandywine Press. And that will be shown in spring of 2022. So we have all of those projects to look forward to. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague Elizabeth Rudy, who is the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Associate Curator of Prints, and Jerry Cohn, who almost needs no introduction, but she'll get one anyway, who is the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Curator of Prints Emerita. In a long career at the Harvard Art Museums, you probably know that Jerry was also director of the Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, now the Straus Center, and twice served as acting director of the museum. So she is still a cherished advisor and colleague. So now I'd like to turn the proceedings over to Elizabeth Rudy to get into the meat of our program. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Martha. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, Jerry and I are happiest when we can have conversations in front of real prints rather than virtual ones, like in the photograph here, where we're standing in the beautiful Art Study Center looking at Rembrandt's Three Crosses. But this we'll have to do for now, because to stop talking about prints would be the real travesty. We've broken this conversation into 7 parts, which we hope will provide a sense of the complexity of our topic and provide a staccato pace to protect us all from the dreaded Zoom fatigue. As Martha said, the prints we'll discuss today are focused around the central question of my upcoming exhibition: what is a print state? The title of the show, as you see here, is States of Play, Prints from Rembrandt to Picasso, which I hope alludes to the intellectual, technical, and visual fun that artists have had over 5 centuries, playing with the possibilities of prints. In the most basic sense, a state is an early version of a print before the composition gets reworked through the addition or erasure of specific elements. This is the print that will open my show next fall. Van Dyck portrayed himself often in paintings, drawings, and prints, but this is my favorite of them all. Van Dyck, though not a professional printmaker, was a fantastic etcher, and he etched this self-portrait himself. His head floats on the empty page, and he turns back to look defiantly at us, the viewer, as if interrupted and perhaps a little annoyed. In the final state of the print, which you see on the right, you have a different, more muted, as in less confrontational context. The copper plate was reworked by the professional engraver Jacobus Niefs, and we now see Van Dyck as a portrait bust perched on a column that bears the title of the suite of prints that will follow. That suite is called the Iconography and consists of portraits that Van Dyck executed in other media, especially painting. He etched many of those plates too, but this title page is still my favorite. In the other plates, he gives at least a cursory sense of bodily form, even in, I'm talking about the first etched only states. But here, it's just his head and the single line of his collar. To me, it seems his most hubristic self-portrait. Sometimes our deep, rich collection doesn't offer the opportunity to study a first state, such as this one, against the final state of the print. But this open, unfinished print after Jacques-Louis David's painting of Bonaparte crossing the Alps always makes me smile. Because if you've seen as many versions of that painting as I have, in France, Germany, Italy, all the imperial territories, there's a joy and a pleasure in sitting with the print and imagining all of its missing strokes and shadows. Thinking about the evolution of prints through their states, that is, from one stage of production to the next, requires close looking and comparison. Working with this fantastic engraving provides a delightful reward because the first state shows the figure wigless. And he isn't just any figure. This is a portrait of the great playwright Carlo Goldoni, one of the most famous authors of the 18th century. And yes, comparing the first and later states of this composition tells you a lot about how the engraver worked. But it's also just entertaining to see such an eminent figure in an unguarded, underdressed moment. You know, Jerry and I actually came to love this pair of prints independent of each other. And when I was talking to her first about the stage show, one of the first things you said, Jerry, was, "Oh, I hope you're going to include that pair of the wig and no wig." And I said, actually, I've been reserving that for the Enlightenment show. And then as the Enlightenment show got more and more unconventional, I realized it was much more impactful and fun to include this pair in a show about states rather than about, you know, playwrights and eminent figures of the Enlightenment, which we'll deal with for sure, but it'll be a little more fun, I hope, in this context. So now we'll move to our next section on groups of progressive states, and I'll pass things over to Jerry.
Yes, the next set is of a famous print by Charles Marion, who is, and I could have the slide, please, who is here working at the composition by tackling the background first. This is possible in etching by only etching a portion of the plate at a time and then regrounding it, that is to say, covering it with a waxy varnish and drawing again successively for successive bitings. Can I have the next, please? Here you see where he has finished the composition essentially. And I want to direct your attention in particular to the upper right corner where you see where he has drawn an oval around the composition, and yet the sky shading has gone beyond. You can see feathers of clouds extending to the right. Can I have the next, please? This is an additional detail of the architecture that he has worked in very carefully. You'll notice that he has added birds over the architecture who did not fly in the first state. And the next, please. Here you get a better view of the upper right corner that you will now see in the next slide. Whoops, no, yet more details. He's being very careful to leave reserves, if you will, for the details that he wants to concentrate on at the very end. And the next. Here you see he has finished the oval and polished out the feathers of clouds. Now I want to emphasize that it is always possible, even with intaglio prints, to erase as well as it is to add, which always surprises people. They always think that if it's in the copper, it's there to stay. But of course it isn't. And you'll see dramatic occasions later in this presentation, where things have been totally changed by the artist. Now, the most important change is the inscription here that he has added. It is, as you see in the translation below, a very, well, even erotic inscription. And he seems to have had second thoughts about that because, in the next slide, you will see that in a later state, the inscription has gone. And again, I make the point that it's not easy to do, but that the etching plate permits erasure, as you see here. Now, our final slide of the set of things, I want you, instead of looking at the pictures, which you've seen already all too much of, I want you to read the captions, because you'll see that every print has the same credit line, the bequest of Joseph B. Marvin. And this introduces the idea, which is very important with printmaking, that collectors can get crazy about states, that the issue of the plate's continuing development over time fascinates collectors because they can see the artist at work, and they sometimes get so entranced that they even go beyond the artist. And for our next set of, excuse me, the cat is coming into the picture. For our next set of continuing states, we will see a somewhat earlier print, a reproductive engraving of the Sistine Madonna. Francis Cawley Gray, Harvard's first great print curator and collector, collected 3 impressions of the published states. That's the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th on your screen now. The only difference in these 3 states is a lack of inscription in the first of the 3, and then differing inscriptions in the bottom ones of the others. The issue here is obviously not the artist's creativity, but simply owning every state. The particular imposition that this print presented was the fact that it's 3 feet tall. And so Gray, in wanting this masterpiece of reproductive engraving, had a very large portfolio indeed to worry about. Now, the credit line on the 4th state, which is the proof state, the etching only, is not entirely correct. Francis Cawley Gray not only gave Harvard his great prints, but he also gave an endowment so that the university could continue to employ a curator for those prints. And the curator, 3 years after Gray's death and the gift of his collection to the university, had to petition the corporation. Imagine petitioning the Harvard Corporation today to spend $130 for the proof impression that you see here on the left. But the Harvard Corporation went along with it. We have now 4 3 feet high Sistine Madonnas in our collection to worry about. For the last slide about the Sistine Madonna, I just show you the change that was so crucial for Francis Cawley Gray to have, which is a script inscription of the title of the Sistine Madonna. And then below, you see a very elaborate dedication to the King Frederick August of Saxony, which probably got a little money into the pocket of both the engraver and the publisher. I think Elizabeth has an even jollier, if you will, set of slides.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, I just wanted, when we were talking about how to structure this talk, and Jerry mentioned wanting to talk about the Mullers and that great story of the curator who just had to have one more. I said, well, then I've got to include the Bouot, because this passion for collecting states is not just the temptation of 19th century curators, but it's also one I'm guilty of as well. This is leading up to a recent acquisition. So this print you see here is one of the finest etchings of its time, the frontispiece of the French journal L'Illustration Nouvelle. It's titled The Funeral of the Burin, and it's a bold proclamation of the superiority of etching, which comes charging at us in the form of a modern steam engine. In the distance, a burin, which is the instrument of engraving, is being carried off or hoisted off into the sky, and its funeral cortege is led by an outmoded horse and buggy. It's just a fantastic, fabulous print. And when I saw the first state on the market, I simply couldn't resist recommending it for purchase to Martha, and to bring it together as we did with the final state in the collection. To see Bouot's first priorities inscribed on this plate was enthralling. The steam engine with its diaphanous smoke, and the Sphinx with a serpent on the tracks below. The Sphinx and the serpent, they nearly disappear in the final state, which you see on the right. They're thrown into the beautiful shadowy burr of his etching needle. And I've already had so much fun spending time comparing these two states, as I hope generations of students will as well.
Now, the collaborative states in proofs brings in, of course, the question of the reproductive engraver and the artist whom you've already seen in the Sistine Madonna and even in the Van Dyck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of my favorite examples from the collection is this proof of a color lithograph by Paul Signac, which was printed by the master printer Auguste Clos. And littering the margins are annotations in pencil about the colors that are deployed through the image. These are details I've enlarged from the right margin, and they read a dark blue, A, and eliminate the red, B. These are directives from Signac to Auguste, or to Clos, with whom he worked closely. And at the bottom of this sheet is a summary list of his annotations. It's topped by the phrase bon à tirer, which means good, literally good to pull or good to print. And this is Signac giving his approval, conditional or dependent on all of his changes being made for the final printing of the lithograph.
Now, this print represents even more of an imposition of the original artist onto his printmaker. This is the mezzotint by David Lucas after the great painting now in the Tate that some of you may well know by John Constable of the water meadows in front of Salisbury Cathedral. This print took more than 4 years to engrave because Constable kept, if you will, making changes that he felt would be an improvement. And we will see details of some of those changes. First, this is the facade of the cathedral. And if you look to the right turret, you can see a change of color. That is Constable's own graphite, where he has redrawn and shaded down that turret in order to change the effect of the billowing clouds of the storm and the rainbow above it. Next. This is the foreground detail of a little dog, where you see that this grayish film has been cast over the mezzotinted ink, which is Constable's own reworking of the water. But I like this detail in particular, not just because it shows up how carefully Constable was working on the plate itself, or rather on the print itself, in order to give guidance to Lucas in his working on the plate, but it shows the detail of the mezzotint burnisher and scraper and little tickles of the touch of the tools of the mezzotint artist in order to make this wonderful reflective quality of the water above the dog. I think that that is a particularly wonderful example of how mezzotint can express tones and lights without lines. Not, however, by Constable's handwriting was it without lines, because of course Here, if you look carefully, especially to the right of the stump of the willow, you'll see lots of very loopy graphite lines that Constable has put in as in an attempt to activate the background for Lucas's edification. This is a sublime impression that is partly valued as an impression of a print, but I think mostly because it shows you the artist's individual touch as he attempts to make it as expressive of his painting as it possibly can be. Constable died only 3 months after this proof was struck, and probably never saw a finished impression. Can we have the next, please? Speaking of his death, one has to think of the survival of their plates. And it is notorious with Rembrandt that so many of his plates survived so many years after his death, and survived in one way or another, reprinting and reprinting and reprinting. Can we have the first? This is the Fogg's impression of perhaps Rembrandt's most famous print, the 100 Gilder print. It is a great impression, and we are very lucky to have it. It was a relatively recent purchase, for we already had an impression of this print, if we can have the next, this print, which was in Mr. Gray's bequest to Harvard. You may say, looking at this, oh, this must be a much later state. It is not. It is the same state as the original, the plate looked originally, and as the other Harvard impression represents very well. This is only a worn impression of the same state. I want to emphasize that prints can look completely different without a change of state, and wear in an intaglio plate, which means that the plate surface has been polished down by repeated printings, can make the lines hold less and less ink, so eventually it becomes just a gray, washed out version of what originally had been rich and black. But that was not the end of the plate. And so there are other states of this composition. Can we have the next? This is an 18th century impression after the plate had fallen in the hands of William Bailey, who, although it may seem like sacrilege to us, spent a great deal of time very carefully re-etching the whole plate. So this is yet another state for the 100 Gilder print. And William Bailey did not stop there. Once he had sold as many as he could of the whole plate, he cut it up, which is even more of a sacrilege to us today, and retouched it additionally. And Harvard does own these 4 fragments, if you will, of the 100 Gilder print, appalling as it might seem.
This trio of objects is used all the time in teaching, and it really never gets old. It's Rembrandt's etched plate for his self-portrait on the left, and 2 impressions from that plate. It's an incredibly instructive group because, as you may notice, I don't know if you can see just yet, but I'll point it out more carefully. Only one of the 2 etchings on the right matches up exactly with the plate. By studying the copper plate, 3 details are significant: the signature at the upper right, the furrow of Rembrandt's brow, and the vertical lines in his cloak. In one of the prints, the one on the left, the signature is missing, and those details of the brow and vertical lines are not as pronounced. So the timeline of these objects is thus: the print on the left was pulled from the copper plate in the 17th century. Then you have the plate, and then which gets into the hands of an 18th century owner. I believe this one was owned by Vatelet. Certain things are improved upon, the addition of the signature, the emphasis on the brow and the vertical lines in the cloak. And then another print was pulled from that plate, the one we see on the right. As Jerry just said, differences in prints do not always mean differences in states. And this is where prints get really fun, because there's so much to see, so much to try to discern and understand, and there's never one size fits all, never one possible answer.
This is the other great famous Rembrandt print, of course. It's the Three Crosses. And Harvard is lucky enough to own three wonderful impressions. The one on the left, part of the Gray bequest. The one on the right, the gift of Philip Hofer, much more recently. These are both the same state, which is a later state of the plate. But what happened to this plate, which is executed entirely in dry point and with some touches of engraving, is that Rembrandt changed his mind, perhaps simply because the dry point had begun to wear out, and redrew a lot of the composition. That is not the question here, however. These are the same state, and it's a question of difference in printing. Can I have the next two details? This is a detail of the central motif, of course, Christ on the cross. And you can see that the plate on the left, the gray impression, is in very good condition with very rich dry point. You can see the burr of the dry point on the upraised arms of Christ and on the figure of the centurion at the left. Not quite so rich as that visible in the Hofer impression, but that is a much more heavily inked impression, and some of that difference is simply a question of inking, not a question of wear on the plate. I want you to carefully look at the figure of the centurion at the lower left, and then we can look at the next slide, where I thought you'd enjoy seeing the same area with the centurion just to the left of the little bit of Christ's thigh that you see at the upper right in the gray impression. And then you see a completely different centurion in place with a horse pointing even in the other way in the left slide, which is a detail from an impression at the British Museum. I want to emphasize here how thoroughly Rembrandt had reworked the plate to introduce a completely different figural composition here, and many other differences as well between the early state and the late state of the print. The late state of the print was, of course, Rembrandt's own printing, and there is none of the pejorative attached here by calling it a late state that there is with the William Bailey prints that we just saw. Can I see the next, please? I want to especially emphasize the difference in inking by showing you two details, which I'm sure you will feel will be illegible, of the foreground. This one directly below the figures, and then the next one, the next pair, even further down, where a figure that is drawn on the left, lower left of the foreground becomes essentially invisible on the darker Hofer impression. Let's return now to the comparison of the whole prints, and you will see now how differently the change in inking makes the approach to the whole composition. The whole composition is entered into by the viewer on the left impression, and the viewer on the right impression, if you will, is inhibited from entering into the composition, but instead one's gaze from afar is focused on Christ. This effect is additionally caused by the condition of the prints, which frankly, none of you can probably see on your screens. You would have to see in the original. But if you look carefully, you will realize that the Hofer impression is cut drastically at the top and at the bottom, whereas the gray impression on the left here has the full size of the plate. One can enter into the plate because there is an avenue to enter in, and there is a sense of space with the sky opening above Christ, partly because of the inking and partly simply because there's more territory there. In the case of the Hofer impression, it reads much more like a panorama across the composition rather than an encircling composition that comes toward you. And so as a panorama, you stand beyond it and outside of it. These kind of differences in inking, in condition, and so forth, always have to be taken into account with any print, but especially with Rembrandt.
My favorite is still the Hofer impression. That's just the gloomy intensity of all that ink. I just love it, even though that's not what Rembrandt wanted, right? He went with the lighter inking.
Well, I think Rembrandt wanted both, in my opinion. He wouldn't have made these variations if he hadn't wanted to see all the different ways the composition could speak to an audience.
It's a fabulous pair to be able to study.
Yes.
So now that we've already complicated things quite a lot with Rembrandt and his consistent inconsistency, let's move to the 20th century, where artists often complicated things with their terminology and made the identification of states more challenging because of their stated intent. These are 3 lithographs by Lee Krasner, which are from a portfolio called Long Lines, dating to 1969. If they look very similar, that's because they are. Each one is a reworking of the same limestone. Krasner reworked a single limestone 4 times, in fact. She started with the blue stone from a series titled Primary Series, which you see on the left. Short time later, she decided to make another portfolio, which would be a rethinking of Primary Series. So she counter-etched and made new additions to the stone, which she also inked in blue and printed. So this was Special Blue G at the top right in a series called Long Lines. She did this 2 more times to create Special H and Special I. She never ground down the limestone all the way. Instead, she left ghost images of the previous iterations on the stones so that they appear within each subsequent print. To my mind, this is a thoughtful and thought-provoking rumination on the proposition of a print state in lithography, where changes are never thoroughly erased, but rather transformed. Some are pushed back, some are brought forward, but the marks on the surface of the matrix are ever present. But she's careful not to say that these are states. These are independent prints that are simply reworkings of a previous project. Now the complicated.
Yes, the same sort of artistic imposition of one plate over another in different combinations is seen in these many prints by Anton Rax, a Romanian artist who came to work with Hayter in Atelier 17 in New York during the Second World War. None of us, and by that I mean Elizabeth and me, but also Christina Taylor in the Conservation Department, have quite figured out what's going on. We think we know, and we're taking advantage here of Christina's work in showing you slides that show the multiplication of plates and images. Here you see prints from each of the plates. And I should acknowledge Thea Goldring as well, a graduate student who has put her work in this. Christina has said, these are her notes here, that no major changes with the plates are noted. That's correct. However, we have noted that the work on the plates is so complex that we are sure that some changes have been made. And in particular, the plate 3, which is a superficial aquatinting of the design over what looks like chaotic engraving, may represent a reuse of a plate. And I would suspect that many of what you see as individual plates here, plate 1 through plate 4, are in fact reworkings of the plate 1, let's say, for plate 4. I'm making this up as I go along because none of us have been able to figure it out. All we know is that all of the plates are 21 5/8 inches high, and there may well be engraving and etching on the fronts and backs of those plates, which do not survive. All we have are the prints that are taken from them. And then we have the next, please. Christina has made very good slides of the combinations that we have all been able to discern, that is to say, Perseus 5. And I should say that the artist himself gave these Roman numerals as if documenting changes of state. Not exactly. So you see here what was printed together to produce Perseus 5. And the next, and Perseus 7 was made by Perseus 2 and Perseus 3. There you get a better view of the chaos on Perseus 3, where the figure is obviously a window going into a previous working of the plate, because these whiter markings have nothing to do with the composition of the figure. Next, please. Question marks. We really can't figure this out until we get to see them again in the flesh, which is what we all devoutly wish. And the next. The most mysterious detail of these various plates to me is this horizontal passage that happens in white in 3 of the compositions and in tone in the Perseus 3, the aquatint plate. This white is not a reserve of varnish over the coating over it. It is instead a digging out of the plate by the engraving tool. This prints in relief. In other words, the paper sank into a cavity in the plate that was so deep that the ink did not reach the bottom. This implies a cavity so deep that you couldn't have burnished it out, which means that all of these plates, all of these details of white signify separate plates. But we don't know. We have to see the originals to find out. And we look forward to that some one of these days. There are more details that show the expressive use of white line that in some cases, like the plate on the right, is undoubtedly a reserve, and on other places on the left is undoubtedly a deep gouging. And we are really, all of us, going to cluster around these prints once the study room opens up again.
They have gotten us turning around and around.
Yes.
But hopefully we'll get there. It's certainly fun. So we've arrived at the last section of our presentation, the ending in the beginning. I hope what Jerry and I have discussed so far highlights the almost perverse complexity of the processes of printmaking, which is a joy to identify and parse and try to find within the prints themselves. But that complexity isn't just visible in the states of a print, It's also tangibly evident from the very beginning in the matrix itself. This is the point I hope to make at the opening of my exhibition through this print titled Unity by the recently deceased artist Louis Delsarte. You can tell by looking at all the colors, patterns, and double lines in this family portrait that there's a complex web undergirding the image. The print was made from 12 matrices, which were used to make this offset lithograph. The artist drew on mylar sheets. Each mylar would print a different color, so it's a 12-color lithograph. The mylar I'm showing you at the right is for the color gray. The sheets themselves are semi-transparent, so Delsarte could place them on top of each other as he worked, deciding where he wanted to emphasize a particular color. They're wonderful objects in and of themselves, as I hope you can see in the detail that I've enlarged here. They're annotated, there's a collage element, a swatch of gray is pasted at the right, and you can see the artist thinking through the problems of color and form at every stage. This is a provisional design for the opening of my exhibition, where all 12 mylars will hang, we hope, in a block. And with these, I hope to convey that prints are iterative, complex, and in process from their very inception. This, I hope to argue, is evident in the matrix or matrices as much as in the pulled states themselves. So thank you. We'll now open up the conversation to all of you. And we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. You can unmute yourselves or type into the chat, as Martha mentioned at the beginning.
I have a question. Can you tell us what's going to be, what is the future of Lois Torf's collection?
Lois Torf's collection is at her home, and I would assume that its future is destined. This is not special knowledge. I assume that its future is destined for the MFA because of her long-standing support of the Museum of Fine Arts. She has been a friend to the FOG as well, but never in the sense of great donations of prints. And her commitment to the MFA is shown by her having given their study room to them. So I think although we remain very friendly with Lois, we have no particular expectation of inheriting all of her prints.
Elizabeth and Jerry, I'm wondering, Suzanne McCullough calling. I'm wondering if you have matrices, either
Oh yes,
that you're including in the exhibition.
Yeah, so there will be the 12 mylars. I hope. We're still working with conservation to see if we can pull that off. And also a copper plate etched and engraved by Lebas for after a painting by Claude Laurent of the port of Messina. It's a very large thing. It's about 2.5 by 2.5 feet. So we'll have one for intaglios, and we also have the impression from an earlier moment in that matrix life opposite the mylars to address planographic.
Wonderful.
I had a question when you mentioned the Hofer Rembrandt, and you said it had been cut and tends to focus the image more. Would that ever have been cut by the artist, or was that just something that happened?
Oh
later?
no, I'm sure, especially with big prints like the Three Crosses is a big print. They are often cut because they are so difficult to handle in the traditional way that collectors kept their prints, which was in albums. And they would be cut out of the album, or their edges would be banged up because they hung out of the albums. So the fact that a large print has been cut down within the plate mark is pretty common, pretty expected. I don't think that Rembrandt would have cut it simply in order to make a panorama out of the picture, for instance, as I have expressed it. I think he would have found ways of inking it to make it more panoramic if that's what he had chosen to do.
Plate marks are trendy, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly in some moments in time, the plate mark was verboten. No one wanted to see the plate mark. It was like showing your work or something, or reminding people that it was a print for, it's so rare. I have not seen very many, 16th century prints with plate marks. Again, not my area of study, but it's not common. Whereas, for the later 18th century, oh, if you don't have the plate mark, it's not,
Yeah.
right?
And albums were much more easily dismantled by cutting the prints out rather than trying to save every vestige of paper like a modern conservator would.
I'll just add, hi, it's Martha. You see that in museum collections where, the print has been folded to fit into a standardized mat, right? I mean, we would never do that now, but it's not uncommon to find that.
In our Spencer albums, the prints are folded to fit into the albums.
They
were put together in the early 18th century.
Right. Other questions?
Jerry, this is Eric in Texas. I love your sweater.
Thank you, Eric.
Hey, listen, I do have a question. What you all's thoughts about the prints, like in the hair one, where sections are left undone? I think in wood engraving shops in the 19th century, they had cloud people, they had tree people, and the blocks would rotate through shops. And I'm wondering if, the one without the hair finished just hadn't made it to the hair person yet. And I mean, I've even seen in Durer's Unfinished States that, that he worked in, there are sections where a figure is just completely left blank and the background is completely done. So it's kind of, I mean, when I work, I try to distribute my marks across the entire matrix because one day I'm better than this other day. So I try to even it all out. So I'm curious about that, if passing around of plates or blocks.
Well, I think in the case of Pitteri, he was an expert technician and he would have done everything. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yes, I don't know enough about Pitteri and his potential workshop, but he had developed a unique to his period style of engraving to mimic the chalk marks of Piazzetta's drawing style. And so he had a cotton industry of just reproducing Piazzetta's designs, specifically his drawings, because they're so soft, these engravings, it's unbelievable. And when you look under magnification at the marks, it's a straight line and then a little bulb and then another straight line. That's how he gets this intense texture. And certainly I think that working on the wig separately is because he'd want to make the wig look or have a different tactile effect that would be different from the skin and the background and the clothes. But I don't know if it would be a workshop assistant or if it'd be him.
When I was speaking with Elizabeth, I think last spring, I was asking her about the request from the Elizabeth Lunning the request, and as I understood it, Elizabeth to say, Liz Lunning only wanted the prints to come from a certain century, or didn't want them to come from maybe from the 21st century. What limitation did Liz Lunning place on her request in terms of time from which the images came?
She was focused on the 20th century. Her very generous gift is focused for the growth of the 20th century collection.
Thank you.
Anybody else? If I could jump in with a question, both for Jerry, Elizabeth, and if she's still with us, Professor Jennifer Roberts. Jennifer, are you still here?
Nope.
No. Okay. Well, you two will have to speak for Jennifer, but we've been happy to see that if anything, there's an uptick right now in the interest of students in prints. Jerry kept that alive and has had many enthusiasts and in fact print scholars go on from the kind of mentoring they got in the study rooms with Jerry. But Elizabeth, you've shared with us recently that you see this as an area where many new Harvard students are showing an interest. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what you think it is about printmaking that's resonating for them right now?
Sure. I mean, my view has been that this is the perfect moment for prints because there's a renewed and very intense interest in materials. And that splinters off in so many different ways. And, you know, you hear things about the developing field of material culture, but also in technical studies. And so prints have, there's so much about the technology of prints to start, you know, that I think it's just, there's so many huge questions embedded in the way prints are made that's one reason that a lot of students are flocking to the field, which is fantastic. And the other reason is that prints are nimble. And prints often respond to contemporary issues in the moment. And with such a focus on contemporary art that's also, you know, it's been developing for some time. I just think that's one of the reasons. I just come across students who, I mean, we have so many more students in the art history department right now who are, you know, we just had the welcome not too long ago. And, you know, almost every single incoming student, no matter what they said their focus was, they would bring up prints in some way, either as a primary interest or an ancillary one. And that's just fantastic, because I think also with this broader attention to media generally in historic as well as contemporary periods, more and more students are realizing that just because someone's a painter primarily doesn't mean that if they didn't make prints or weren't involved in the print market. Van Dyck is a great example, but then you think of Rubens and so many others, Proudhon too, who may not have been actually making prints, but who are directly engaged with the print market and marketing their art that way. So
I also think there is a much more pragmatic reason for students' interest in prints, which Elizabeth is certainly fostering, which is that prints are much more accessible.
Right.
They're cheap, they're everywheres, they're easily hung on the wall compared to sculpture or paintings or anything like that. And the print rental program is only a part of that. There are prints available everywheres, and the students very quickly get to feel that they too can have an original work of art.
That's kind of where I was going, Jerry. Thank you for mentioning print rental. And I do think, you know, prints have always raised questions about audience, right? And, you know, as much as they encourage artists in experimentation in terms of materials and techniques, they also encourage experimentation in marketing and audience. And, you know, the museum world now is thinking so much about audience. Who are we for? How do we engage?
I was lucky enough to be able to buy the portfolio that was originally created in New York City in order to defy the slumlords. And these were prints that were pasted up on the walls of decaying structures that the slumlords were taking over and making into bad apartments. These are the kinds of prints that exist even now that students are collecting off walls, you know, and those are just as much original prints, maybe not by Rembrandt and Dürer, but they're much loved by the people who have gotten them.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. And then, of course, at Harvard, we're lucky also to have faculty that are really engaging, you know, with printmaking in very creative ways. And Jennifer Roberts, I'm sorry, she was with us earlier, but she is somebody who's paired up with an artist printmaker, also on the Harvard faculty, Matt Saunders, to offer a very innovative course around printmaking practice and the kinds of maneuvers and thinking that are required by printmakers. And Jerry, you were kind enough to give a beautiful impression of the Constable David Lucas Salisbury Cathedral print in Jennifer's honor. So it's wonderful to see curators and faculty and students all coming together around this enthusiasm. Do we have any final questions from our audience?
I have a question. I realize it's out of line with the presentation today, but one fantastic collection of, at least of images, has been printed on the Suramonos that Harvard has. And maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I saw a few of them, and then haven't emerged since. And my question is anyone prepared a monograph about the development of plexiglass over the last 30 or 40 years to make it possible to at least image these Suramonos? I'm not so interested in personally in the poetry. And Jerry once said that you wanted the poetry to be presented at the same time as the image. But I think the images are so magnificent, even though they're not reproduced, they're a form of print that Harvard has a fantastic collection, and it is hidden, and no one ever sees them for understandable reasons. So I hope that might change if plexiglass has changed in any positive ways over the last 30 or 40 years.
Well, I think the Japanese galleries have lately been taken up with the Feinberg collection for good reason. I think that's a magnificent collection. The expectation will always be, with all of the works on paper, even the Suramonos, which are certainly the most fragile because of their organic dyes, that they will only be up briefly and only a few of them at a time. I think ultimately Harvard would hope to have a glorious Suramono exhibition and catalog, but in the meantime, I think you're just going to have to be patient and see a few at a time.
I don't have any more. Don't have any more years to be patient.
Well,
my problem.
Nor do I.
Alan, it may then make you happy to know that we are planning somewhat of a renovation of the Japanese galleries to accommodate cases that will allow more art forms from the collection, including the Suramono, to take part in those rotations. So that actually is on the nearer term horizon. Of course, we have to get the museum open and be able to ship the cases from Italy during COVID and all of that. But the plan is actually to make those Japanese galleries more flexible for different formats, including the Suramono. So that is, and of course, you know, in the meantime, faculty, people like Professor Yukio Lippett can call for any of those things in the study centers for their classes.
And you could come in and call for them too once the museum is open.
Right, anybody.
Don't forget that, Alan.
I've actually been talking to Rachel over the last couple of months about how we can bring Japanese prints into the European galleries, and not just the usual 19th century, which is expected, hopefully the 18th or even 17th century galleries in our rotation spaces. She's really committed to bringing out that collection more, and I'm hoping that it will spark new interest in broader audiences than just those who may go into the Japanese galleries to see them in other spaces.
Hi, Jerry and Elizabeth. It's Melinda in New York, and I have to say that you've both inspired me, because as you know, it's a time of turmoil down here, and there are signs all over. And I have to get out and try to walk a mile and a half every day. And I figure I can just lift them right off the.
There you go.
And they
will be an original print.
Absolutely. So I'm very inspired. Thank you very much.
Good.